Okay, so we can start.
Okay, well, so first of all, thank you so much for this kind of invitation. And I do have to apologize again for the slight delay. I will be better at checking time differences next time. But most importantly, I'd like to thank you for giving me an opportunity to get my ducks in a row because having to talk to a neuroscience community after a very long lapse has made me have to think a little bit about where the cognitive neuroscientist in me went. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that I've been doing for the last 2 years in my new position at the Technical University of Dresden, where I work primarily on social touch. But importantly, we look at how we may want to incorporate touch into our digital social exchanges. And what I'd like to sort of tell you about is today, and I've had to reformulate this for myself, is why I think that's interesting and why I think it fits in with the puzzle that has been my work to date. So, to start, maybe I should just tell you a little bit about myself. My research in general has focused on multisensory perception and particularly the limits of multisensory perception. I've been interested in thinking about how we use our many senses to explore and understand the world, but also importantly, the other people we share our time in this world with. And I'm particularly drawn to the stimuli and responses to them that vary over time. So I'm really interested in dynamic changes. Much of my work to date has been driven by my curiosity slash my interest in the hard cases or the interesting cases where I feel sensory perception is pushed to its limits, like looking at perceptual illusions, and you can see me twisting a very cool piece of artwork on the far left, but also processing multiple streams of music, and indeed looking at complex multisensory interactions like the taste and vision of these beautiful plates of food on the far right. But beyond individual perception, obviously the greatest challenge to our senses is how we rely on them to facilitate social interactions. Two-way iterative exchanges of verbal and nonverbal social cues, dynamic multisensory information that has to be streamed and passed and made sense of. And now, in a post-COVID digital world, I suppose my overarching research question is how do we connect with others over Zoom, like we are now, or in virtual reality? And I suppose the cynic in me, either because I'm a musician and so I've felt the real life, thrill of working with other musicians, or because I'm a mother of five and have dogs and cats, and so I'm clearly a touchy-feely person, I have my misgivings about whether or not we're able to connect with others via Zoom or in VR. And so most of the work that I do is to try and assuage my fears that actually it's not at all possible. And where this all comes from is that for at least about 10 years, maybe a little bit more, I've been working on face to face examples of temporal coordination and social touch. And through that work, including some with Guillaume Dumas, we've come up with a sense of how it is that people become aligned with one another. And since that paper with Guillaume, I've actually started to think beyond alignment and more about connection and feelings of co-presence. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in the next few minutes. But that work generally has led me to believe that there is something very special about the way that we connect with others, both through time and through touch. And so the work I'm going to tell you about today is examples of both temporal coordination and social touch in a digital world, with the question as to whether or not this is comparable to the forms of coupling, alignment, shared presence, feelings of connectedness that we have in face-to-face interaction. So I'm going to tell you about two experiments in which we look at temporal coordination, but within the digital realm, and then how we've looked at adding touch either separately or in tandem with temporal coordination tasks to see if there's a more is more effect. So to begin with, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I think has been the crux of my work since doing more meaty neuroimaging work, which is to go deeper into the theoretical construct that I think underpins this feeling of connectedness. But really at the heart of it is the question that keeps coming back to me is why we want to connect with others. Why do we coordinate with others? And in particular, why do we want to connect with many others? Right now, I'm speaking to you, and I don't see many of you, unfortunately, but we are connecting through time and space, and it's really hard. For example, I can't see you, and I'm struggling to get a sense of the room. So if it's so difficult, why do we do it? And I started to get a glimpse of the answer in a couple paragraphs from this wonderful book by William McNeill. And in it, he answers my question of why, if it's so hard, if it's such a challenge to our multisensory system to coordinate with others, what is the benefit? Why do we keep doing it? And he talks a lot about so-called muscular bonding, a feeling of being connected with those with whom he was forced, in this case, to march, as he says, aimlessly about on the drill field. And in doing so, he describes a sense of pervasive well-being. Okay, so maybe that's why we do it, just because it feels good. But what was interesting for me is that he goes on to say that he felt a strange sense of personal enlargement, a sort of swelling out, becoming bigger than life. And it's actually from this last section that it occurred to me that beyond the changes to the we, which Guillaume and I have talked about, and many of us have tried to capture either at the level of motor coordination or at the level of the brain, looking at neural synchrony, this so-called we or collective muscular bonding, as he talks about. Beyond that, he talks about a change in the me. And that's sort of led me down to this idea that really the mechanism that underpins both the changes we experience in how we feel about others and ourselves when we interact socially is the so-called self to other ratio. And I know I'm not the only person working on this now, but at the time it was sort of restricted to the musicology literature, where it was used to describe a so-called volume balance in a choir. And you can maybe try and imagine this. Maybe you've had an experience of it, but I always had it because I have a very large voice and I'd always have to try and blend more to mix the self more into the other. But it was also talked about a bit in the social sciences when it was detailing how, when speaking in public, like now, there was an attentional switch determining whether to integrate the others because they were in my in-group and I know them and I trust them, or indeed to segregate, to keep them out because they're an out-group. But principally, it underlies and differentiates that to coordinate with others, we rely on this nuance and evolving. And I think that's the really crucial thing. This is not a static thing, that there's an evolving balance of self and other related information. And it's as a function of this ratio, I will use and integrate either more or less self other information to coordinate my movements with yours. And so the hypothesis I'm try to continually test is that this self to other ratio will depend on who and how many people we are coordinating with, but also importantly, based on the nature of the sensory information available. So one of the critical questions I ask myself now, doing all this work on social touch, is whether touch does something special to the way in which we balance the self and other ratio. And I'll come back to this at the end of the talk. Principally, the idea is that some information is going to be deemed more useful, more reliable, more salient. In one example, you might follow a good leader because they're providing a really stable piece of information, in which case you might upregulate the other. But if it's deemed less relevant, or because it comes from individuals who are less like me, for example, those outgroup members we just talked about, then the signal itself may be deemed less important and we will segregate it and keep it out of the picture. The nature of the signal itself, like this Zoom call right now, where I think the quality is pretty good, but if, for example, the lagging video got in my way for understanding, I might actually tune it out and just focus on giving my talk rather than trying to understand what was going on the other end of the call. And indeed, the work that I've done previously has tried to focus a lot on how this is done at the level of an interacting dyad. And we've tried to describe how optimal coordination depends on this beautiful balance of self and other information. Now, we've gone so far as to try and create a sense of what happens at the level of the brain. So there is at least one slide with brains in this. And I'd like to say that this work was obviously really interesting at the time, but what I'm hoping to convince you of is that I've needed this time away from cognitive hardcore neuroscience to get my ducks in a row, to be better equipped, I think, to handle the nature of two brains. So all the data I had done until present was really looking at the single brain and trying to understand what happened as a function of the information that was available, the number of people I was dealing with, the kinds of people I was dealing with, if they were more or less reliable, and looking specifically at brain areas that either were integral for integrating other information into the collective whole, or indeed focusing, and obviously right inferior frontal gyrus was seen as really, critically involved in this process of control and providing us a self-based tempo in some of our finger tapping tasks. There've also been some wonderful work by people probably in this room, but various colleagues of mine, including Daniela Zamla and Jacopo Novembre, who've been really wonderful at identifying some critical indexes of this shift in attention. Alpha suppression, for example, with EEG being seen as this critical little tuning mechanism. And I think that what I'm excited to understand in this next step in my career, now that I've put some of the nuts and bolts of the theory together, is see how that works within a group, but also how touch maybe triggers this tuning mechanism. Now, to get onto the crux of today's talk, which is to see how all of this applies to digital interactions, and focusing in on this idea that I have a sort of signal-based account of how indeed we could find and hone this balance between self and other information. So honing in on this idea that there's reliability of the signal, there's accessibility of the signal, there's information out there in the world across our many senses that's going to determine whether or not I integrate other information or focus on myself. And if we consider a busy Zoom-based exchange like the following, where they're trying to sing a happy birthday, and you can already just see the video is lagged, and if the sound is playing, which I think it might not be, it's an awful cacophony. And what I'm hoping to show you is that not only is it terrible in terms of an example of social coordination, they sing out of tune, they can't sing together, they still seem to be having fun, they still seem to be enjoying it. So it seems like, and I'm hoping to show you some evidence of that, there it is possible to do so-called virtual muscular bonding, if I take the terminology of McNeil that I talked about a few slides ago. Before I get on to talking about two paradigms in which we've looked at virtual muscular bonding, I want to just put it out there that I'm clearly not the first person to look at group interactions. We know a lot about how and why we coordinate with one other person. I've mentioned some of the work that we've done on interacting dyads. And a lot of what I'm saying, obviously, is an extrapolation of that. Additionally, there are also several good studies that have looked at how groups interact. And these range from work by Richardson and colleagues who've looked at spontaneous coordination, people in rocking chairs. Alan Wing and Mark Elliott have done some beautiful ecological work on musical ensembles. More recently, Müller and colleagues have shown how professional choirs coordinate. I've told you a little bit about this self-other balancing that goes on there. But they go on to also talk about how they reorganize into smaller groups, depending on whether they're singing in canons or in unison. I'm going to talk a little bit about this reorganization in a few slides' time as well. In one of only a handful of studies on dance, Chauvigny et al. Have also looked at the effect of holding hands. That is additional sensory information. So a really rich multisensory information exchange in that case, and how that changes the way in which the groups couple together. And I think that that's sort of the final point that I'm hoping to make today, is that I feel that there is something special about adding touch into this mix. We have also done a little bit of work on group coordination. There's a lovely study by Bahar Tungchenk and myself where we did a live science study at the Tate Museum. We had 100 groups of 7 strangers walking together in a circle. And I would recommend maybe having a look at that because it was a really good case of having to figure out how to deal with that noisy, messy data. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that as well. The methodological challenges of looking at temporal, at time course data when you're dealing with messy environments. Obviously, my long-term collaborator, Guillaume Dumas and Ruth Feldman, came out with a lovely paper in which they compare real face-to-face interactions with Zoom-based interactions. And there they show altered brain behavior associations and also this attenuated interbrain synchrony in digitally mediated interactions. And I suppose that's sort of where I thought all of my work would lead me down as well, to just saying that it's a less rich environment and it's never going to be the same. But I hope to show you that there is hope. And to do that, I want to tell you about 2 paradigms that I've been running to try and find a balance between ecological validity and experimental control, while also trying to do group coordination research in a digital age. To manipulate self-other processing, I use what I think are 2 quite immersive sensory motor coordination tasks. And with these, I vary group size, but also composition, so who is in the group, to investigate how an individual's behavior changes over time, depending on who they're interacting with and how big the group is. On the left-hand side, we have an adaptation of a very well-established theater exercise, the so-called mirror game. And in our online version, the players must try to copy the movements of other players on the screen. And I can show you what that looks like, but please note that they are moving just extremely slowly because this is a group of experts where they really are focusing in on the movements of others. And from the data we get from this, we can try to determine if an individual is focusing their attention on all the other members of the group, or maybe just their nearest neighbor, so the Zoom window closest to theirs, or perhaps they take the lead focusing only on setting a steady example, so they're not actually looking at the others at all. By contrast, in the mirror game, players are instructed to work together as a group, but in the second paradigm, shown on the right, a so-called group walking paradigm, we introduce a contrasting model of interpersonal coordination in which the individual has their own goal, which is to coordinate with a pacing signal that they hear in the background. But then we look at how they are influenced by the social context in which they find themselves. For example, how similar are the people around them? And to do this, we make use of immersive virtual reality environments like this one. And we mess around with the size of the groups of people that the participant finds himself walking with, as well as the composition. But importantly, I want to just stress that their explicit task is to follow the metronome, and we're really just looking at the pool of the social others around them. So let me tell you a little bit first about the Zoom-based mirror game. And again, I'll let this video play in the background because it's quite hypnotic. And so if I say something silly, you'll have something to look at. So we first used the Zoom mirror game in a COVID online conference. So in a setting much like the one I'm in now, I'm talking to you from far away. I don't really know any of you. And we needed to break the ice. So my wonderful research assistant, Yasmin Abra, suggested that we play the mirror game, which I had no idea what she was talking about, but I love her so much. I said, sure. And so we did. And in this game, players are instructed to try to act as one, to move together in such a way that an outside observer should not be able to determine who was leading and who was following. And the result of doing this in this conference was extremely powerful. Even just watching the video, hopefully now it produces a sort of eerie feeling of connectedness. And after 2 minutes, the breakout session went on to be with these random people who I'd never spoken to before, turned into be an incredible success with basically all the participants saying just how close they felt to these new friends. So there was something very powerful, something that really did connect these strangers simply through temporal coordination in what is a very sensorially poor environment. There's clearly no touch. There's clearly some lag, and the screen is very small. And as a function of this sort of signal-based approach, there's not much information to go on. However, we seem to have found some interesting effects. And to do this study, what we tried to capture is, on the one hand, objective measures of interpersonal synchrony or coupling, and on the other hand, trying to understand how they felt about themselves and the others in the group. How we did this is we used the video recorded through the Zoom interface and use motion energy analysis, which is, for those who do not know, it's an objective automated method that continuously monitors the amount of movement occurring in predefined regions of interest. And in this case, it allowed us to objectively quantify the synchronicity between individuals, pixel by pixel, over time. The subjective reports we asked are some that you will hear about over and over again today, including this self in other measurement, which I will, as I say, mention a few times today. But we also asked them about social cohesion and how they felt about themselves. And although there's lots of this data, I'm primarily trying to just tell you a little bit about some of the cool things that we found. So in this paradigm, individuals first interacted in dyads. So I'm going to first tell you about a little bit of the data from these interactions at the level of the dyad. To do the correlation-based analysis of the two-person data sets, we create these random pairs out of our data, these shuffled dyads, and we compare that to our real pairs. And looking at, and that's what we sort of see on the left-hand side, just making contrasts of those real pairs versus the random shuffled pairs. Looking at that, we see comparisons, and on the x-axis, you always have the real group versus the random pair. And what I'm showing here is data from two conditions, one in which they saw themselves on the Zoom call, and that's why you see two little faces in the little monitor in the middle panel, and one condition in which the self Zoom window was hidden and all they saw was their coordinating pattern. So first of all, I hope that you know that you have control over this in your Zoom, that you can hide yourself, and maybe I'll tell you why that might be a good idea. So first of all, when they have the self-seen condition, when they see themselves as well as their coordinating partner, we find that self-information, purely in the visual domain, is in fact useful for coordination. We see greater coordination compared to the random pairs, and indeed compared to the self-hidden. However, when we hide the self, when they only have information about the other, we see a shift, I apologize, we see a shift of focus to the other. And as a result, although coordination is still fairly good, it improves a lot of the subjective measures that we were trying to capture, including mood, cohesion, and trust. And so what I hope we see here is, as a function of accessibility, whether or not self-information is actually available, you see a shift in focus from either incorporating self and other information, or indeed, in this case, segregating self-information and focusing in on the other. And this made me think of some anecdotal experiences I've had. For example, when practicing ballet, we always have that mirror next to us to watch ourselves, to watch others, and it gives us this extra piece of information to help us coordinate our movements. However, obviously, when we then move to the stage, we have to just focus on the others participating in the performance on stage, which makes us feel that incredible sense of connectedness when dancing or performing together. The same participants then coordinated with groups of 8. There are 9 Zoom blocks here because one of the middle top row is in fact my research assistant. So they coordinated in groups of 8. And there again, they were explicitly told to try and coordinate and act as a single unit. They did this over multiple phases, ranging from free mirroring, where there was no specific leader, and also some leader-led examples. I'm not going to go into that data now. The main reason I want to show you this data is to tell you that one of the things that I've been trying to work on as I've shifted from work on dyads to work on groups is the best way to handle time course data of this rich nature, but also how to deal with time course data that's extremely messy. So we tried all the traditional approaches when looking at this motion energy analysis output. And I have to frankly say that we struggled. And we then decided to opt for looking at a dynamic time warping approach, which like many of the other time course approaches, is looking for temporal similarity between two sequences, but it does so regardless of temporal misalignment. What it does is it aligns the sequences and by warping the time axis non-linearly. And as a result, it's been extremely useful looking at speech recognition, gesture recognition, and time series classification where there is messiness. And so obviously the key advantage of this DTW is to handle nonlinear temporal misalignment, which is present in real world time series data and notoriously in Zoom video call data. It calculates a distance value that we can compute. And what it does is it sums all the minimum values, providing an aggregate representation of the overall difference between two time series. What the DTW, or this dynamic time warping, calculates is the Euclidean distance between two signals. Therefore, if you have a lower signal, this represents more similar signals. Just to rush to the punchline, what we see at the bottom right-hand side is our various novice and expert groups. And what we were looking for here is just a sanity check before moving on to some more exciting analyses, that in fact our experts, shown in blue, would show lower DTW values versus the novices, who would have both larger circles and circles that were higher in weight. So we could see that this approach was helping us to identify coordination differences across our two groups as a function of their expertise. But this was helping me to better understand how I might be able to deal with temporal coordination data within the messiness of the digital realm. But because I really found working on the Zoom data quite challenging because of this messiness, because of the lags, we have also done quite a bit to try and work in what I find a slightly more controllable context of virtual reality. And I'm very fortunate to have really exciting kit and wonderful colleagues who help me to do this. And importantly, one of the really wonderful things about working in this controllable environment is that I can focus in on the nature of the group within which we are interacting. So looking at how group makeup varies how I coordinate with others and how that makes me feel. We've recently published a study in which we had a low-tech version of our group walking task, in which individuals simply wore a pair of headphones and heard the sounds of those around them. So in terms of the nature of the sensory information available, it was fairly limited. It was just auditory information, the sounds of 8 walkers walking around a central participant. And in this paper, publication on the bottom right in iScience, we showed that indeed coordination performance was better when they were walking with a group of distinct sounding others. So the others were wearing a nice pair of very clanky cowboy boots. And I'm happy to show you pictures of these extremely cool cowboy boots that we pimped up with various chains and other malarkey to make them sound really clangy. When walking with others who made this really distinct but synchronous sounding footstep sounds, this helped us to better process. It gave us more information about how to interact with and coordinate with the pacing signal, our explicit task. So just a reminder there, they had the explicit task of walking in time with a pacing signal that they heard. And then they heard the sounds of virtual others around them. And we were interested in the implicit nature of this social pool, whether or not walking with different people around us either distracts us from the task or helps us do the task better, and importantly, how that made us feel. And interestingly, and now just focusing in on the middle panel on the far right, is that we see that in walking with others who make a distinct but synchronous sounding footstep sound, it made us feel stronger and a greater sense of self-agency. And I think that this data was really the first time that I connected those powerful paragraphs from McNeil at personal enlargement, but also well-being, with some evidence of that in an empirical setting. So we start to see why we might want to coordinate with others and what that effect has on ourselves. So we moved to virtual reality, and now people were indeed walking with the sounds of others, but they could also see the others. And I'll just play the video in the background while I speak. We see here what the participant sees first when they're embodying their avatar. And then once they have embodied it, they walk across 4 randomized experimental blocks with the sound of a pacing signal, which I'm not sure you can hear, but they hear a pacing signal, but they also see and hear virtual others walking with them. Now, just remember, their explicit task is to walk in time with the metronome. While walking, they can look around at either a small or a large group of avatars, and whose movements follow those pre-recorded live footsteps that we actually used in our previous study. And these avatars can either match the race of the participant or not. So they can either be an out-group or an in-group. And then again, our analysis, what we're trying to do is investigate this pool of the social agents that surround the participants and the impact this has on the coordination task with the metronome, and additionally, how it changes how they feel about themselves and others. And so our measures include, I'm going to try and stop that horrible video for a second. Our measures include both coordination measures of interpersonal synchronization, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what that data showed in a minute, but also the consequences of that coordination, how that coordination makes us feel, these subjective measures of coupling. Just a reminder again, we have 4 conditions. They're walking either with a small or a large group of virtual others, and those others can either be representative of in-group members or out-group members. I'm just going to show you a little bit about some of the data that we've found so far, this pool of the crowd effect. And I'm focusing in on just some highlights here so that I can hopefully save a little bit of time to tell you about the work we've done on touch. We see overall an effect of having a large group. So we actually see a main effect of group size, where larger groups give us more information to coordinate with that metronome. Just remembering again that the sounds of these others were pre-recorded marching to the same pacing signal. So inherently they had originally the same goal. And by having these virtual others around us marching in time to that same pacing signal, improved coordination. Just a reminder here that in this top right-hand panel, down is good. So lower standard deviation of asynchrony is in fact greater performance. So in that large group, we're seeing greater coordination performance, and particularly a coupling. To have a low standard deviation of asynchronies, you're required to know who is you and who is me, and try and make the difference between the onset of my footstep and your step smaller and consistently smaller over time. So we'd see that more walking with large groups. We do not see any effect of in or out group. When we turn to the subjective measures, I'm focusing in on 3 critical ones in which we get significant effects: dominance, looking time, and self in other. And I told you that there would be a lot on self in other, so this is one of those results now. We see, first of all, looking on the far right, an effect of group. Again, that in these large groups, we see a greater sense of self in other. And I think that this is really a critical piece of evidence that goes in line with McNeil's idea of this virtual muscular bonding, muscular coupling, I apologize. Interestingly, we do get some effects to do with in and out group, and I don't want to dwell on these, but I think that there's a lot more to be done in terms of, especially work in virtual reality, trying to understand what happens when we work with others that are not like us or who don't behave like us. I think some of the reasons why we don't get a lot of big effects with our in and out group manipulation is because typically I think that it's more about how the avatars behave rather than the way the avatars look. Indeed, this looking time is how much participants felt the avatars were looking at them not the other way around. And they find that in the out group, they rate that the virtual avatars, who are not programmed any differently to the in-group avatars, are looking at them more. They feel like they are being watched. So there's clearly something about the behavior of these other avatars that actually changes the way we feel about interacting with them. And lastly, when we think back to that McNeil comment of a personal enlargement, of feeling bigger, we see, like we did in our first study on group walking, which I showed a few slides ago, that there seems to be a nice little interaction on perceived dominance. It's the small in-group in which we feel a greater sense of dominance. So there's something about this cozy number of 7 virtual others looking like me, walking like me, that makes me feel bigger. And this has always been one thing that I'm really interested in, is the nature of what kind of group size gives us the greatest boost that shows some of these positive benefits of social coordination. And I very much hope that in the near future, I'll be looking at these critical group size thresholds and the effects that interacting with these different groups has on our perception of ourselves, but also how we feel about others. In the last bit of time that I have to talk to you today, I would like to make a little bit of a shift in gear. I've told you a lot about temporal coordination because for much of my academic career, I have focused on the strength of coordinating with others in time, that feeling like somehow my actions have an effect on your actions, which have an effect on my actions, which is clearly really good evidence that we coexist, that we are indeed connected. But maybe because I'm that touchy-feely person, I literally do have 2 dogs next to me and a baby sleeping behind me and then 4 others upstairs. I know that touch is special. Before I started my job in Dresden, I had only done 1 study on touch, and I'd done it on little babies. I had a little baby of my own, and she was my first guinea pig. And I was mesmerized by watching these little 6-month-olds trying to grab the paintbrush that I was trying to stroke them on. And I noticed and knew that this was truly an interesting new avenue for me to explore. But then I didn't do anything on it for almost a decade. And now I'm back. I'm looking at social touch and the effect that it has on how we connect with others, and principally whether we can do it within the digital domain. Obviously, there is a question in the back of a lot of people's heads, including my own, is whether or not we want to touch people in virtual reality or in a Zoom call like this one. And I'm happy to discuss that as well. But I think I'm hopefully going to show you some data that it does feel like something interesting. I'm not sure whether it feels the same as touch face to face, but it clearly has some powerful effect. And so I'm going to tell you about 2 paradigms that we've done in my group to try and test whether or not we can indeed experience social touch in the digital context. To begin with, we have a study just very recently published in which we tried to explore whether or not adding physical touch, so in this case, literally the experimenter stroking somebody's arm while they were also existing in a virtual in a VR environment. You see here that the participant is the person seated and they get stroked on either their arm or their back by this lovely lady standing next to them. And so we have a very simple design in which they are either stroked on their arm or on their back. And when stroked on either their arm or their back, they either only see the touch or they see and feel the touch. So we see a blue condition of visual only information versus a visual tactile information. We did also manipulate context, and I can talk about that later if you're interested. Critically, and sort of key to most of the work that I do, I try to capture the phenomenon that I'm testing at several levels. I look at subjective ratings, I look at changes in behavior, in this case, whether they like the task enough to do it more times. And I also captured physiological measures, in this case, heart rate, because there's a lot of good literature on social affective touch that shows that when you stroke people at a so-called optimal velocity, optimal because of the C tactile afference in our hairy skin that is preferentially activated, does its job best within a very specific range at 3 to 10 centimeters per second, you see this really beautiful relaxation response at the level of heart rate, or indeed galvanic skin response. And so what we wanted to see is whether or not we see these typical responses to either simply visually mediated touch or visuotactile mediated touch. And so I just want to tell you about 3 key results that we found, where I think we've shown that more is indeed more, at least within this particular example. We see that, for example, the visuotactile condition results in greater sense of ownership. They feel more agentive of their body. They also feel that the interaction with their virtual partner, stroking them, is richer in quality. And they feel this both at both the arm and the back sides. And I think most importantly, we only see the resulting change in heart rate response, this decrease in arousal state in the visual tactile condition. So we find that it's more pleasant when you have more information to create the sense of touch. They feel a greater sense of engagement, and indeed it modulates arousal in the manner that we expect from real face-to-face or skin-to-skin interaction. But, and this is the drum roll, this is the bit I think that I hope is the icing on the cake of the talk, is that I'm very interested to look at examples of touching without touching. And I'm going to tell you that this is based on a very significant body of work on so-called vicarious touch. You just have to watch films like Love Actually, where they're all hugging and kissing in the airport scene, and you feel all of those good feelings of interpersonal connection without personally feeling it yourself, without any skin contact whatsoever. And there's some very nice fMRI data, but also ERP data, in which they show that the responses are extremely comparable between so-called vicarious experiences of touch and real skin-to-skin touch. And that's led me to explore the use of this so-called pseudo-haptic illusion. I'm going to just show you what it looks like now. This so-called embodied telepresent connection is a beautiful, beautiful virtual environment built in Canada, so it has to be good, by Bernhard Rieke's group, in which these incredibly just really exciting avatars that change in color as you approach or make physical contact, that make a pinging sound as you make physical contact, but also have a dynamic change in tone as you approach before you make contact. So I remind you, I really love these dynamic cues, or these dynamic pieces of information we have that help us to better understand the world around us. This ETC does all of that, and there's absolutely no physical touch whatsoever. Instead, people describe feeling warmth when they make the connection. When they dare to touch that beating heart that you can see, they feel, they report that they feel the pulsing. And importantly, they feel a lot of the positive effects of physical somatosensory-based touch. And so we've been playing around with this for quite a bit of time now. We have actually 4 new studies ongoing with it, but I'm just going to show you some data that is hot off the press, in which my postdoc, Irena Valori, has been collecting all possible kinds of information. And I'd like you to just excuse me that I do not have any of the FNIRS data, but I can show you that they've been collecting it, and our poor participants were wired up to the hilt. The participants were pairs of friends, so they were interacting in this 2-person setup of the embodied telepresent connection environment. They were therefore wearing their head-mounted display, these big heavy caps, and they had their FNIRS caps centered around them. They also had heart rate measurements, and we are able to also, through the recorded video of their interaction, capture motor coupling using similar approaches to the ones we did with our Zoom-based data, our motion energy analysis. Just to remind you, there are basically 2 conditions in this experiment. One in which they have pseudo-haptics, and that's represented by these very red hands. So telling you that they got this audio-visual illusion to help them feel the touch. But then they also had interactions in which they didn't have the pseudohaptic enhancement, but they could indeed merge their avatar with the other, make contact with them. And all I want to show you today is 4 little results that we have from this data so far. One in which, and you're going to hear words that you've heard before, that indeed adding the pseudohaptic, having this additional sensory information that helped you to connect and coordinate with others, improves your own sense of ownership. I've showed you data where that's been the case before, that we have a greater agentive experience, and this time because we've added in touch. Perhaps unsurprisingly, adding the pseudohaptic gives you a sense of co-presence. And I think that that's really the core of why I am interested and pulled into thinking about how we feel connected through touch. It gives us this really good hard evidence that we are co-located in space, because if I'm touching you and you're touching me, we must be in the same room. We must be together. And yet here, this is all through an illusion. So that information, that sensory data, is a trick, and yet it still results in a higher sense of co-presence. Lastly, we see that it has an effect on interpersonal distance. After having, sorry, I've lost the pre-post here, but the 2 dots on interpersonal distance represent their preferred interpersonal distance before the task with pseudohaptics and after. And once they've done this beautiful dance in virtual reality with the pseudohaptic information, they actually prefer being closer to others. They have a smaller interpersonal distance. The last data, which I am just really interested in, is that this change in interpersonal distance is co-varies as a function of their reported self in other, which I think has something to do with the nature of the avatars in which they're embodying, these unbounded confetti-like avatars. And so those people who have a higher self in other, who have this merging, are also the ones that are seeing the greatest change in their interpersonal distance. But it should be noted that this is not for everybody. It's primarily for the person with whom they've done this virtual dancing with. And because I'm seeing the time, I want to thank you very much for your attention today. I hope what I've told you today is that we can feel connected with others, not only through temporal coordination, with getting this information that my actions affect your actions and vice versa, but also that social touch is a critical way in which we get good, hard sensory evidence that we are connected in some way. And I hope that through some of my experiments where we've done this in the digital world, we've been able to play around with the kinds of sensory information that is available to help us make that decision, to determine or not whether or not we are co-present, whether or not we are in our bodies and connected somehow with your body. And that leaves me just to say thank you for your time, for this wonderful invitation, and to my incredible team and all my collaborators who've helped me to come up with some of these ideas and do some of these crazy experiments. If there are any questions, I am very open to answering.
Can you hear us?
I can. It's a little bit quiet, but I'm going to see if I turn my volume up a little bit. Yeah, it should be fine now.
Thank you so much for this great talk, and the studies are super cool, really.
I'm so glad.
Thank you. So we'll take the questions now.
Lovely.
There's one on Zoom. No.
Non, c'est qu'il y a une personne connectée qui veut poser une question, elle peut ouvrir son micro et poser la question.
Okay, yes. Anony, you can ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Merle. It was an incredible presentation. I'm a PhD student of Guillaume Dumas, and I'm
Okay, hi.
autism and like multimodal, interpersonal synchrony with Remy also that is online, like
Very nice.
on the project. So I'm more starting my PhD. I'm in the 2nd year, and I'm working in neurophenomenology of togetherness. So I started using inclusion of the other in the self scale with the kids, and that works quite well. And I was wondering, I'm designing right now subjective reports to try to have qualitative and quality data to be able to analyze. That is not easy to merge qualitative and quantitative data. Can you say a word on what type of subjective reports you get? How you grab all this? You talk about co-presence, you talk about enlargement of the self, and this is for instance, two semantics that I don't use. And yeah, so we have the problem of phenomenology with the language we use to express what we feel on all this. And
happy to answer. I'm going to throw like spaghetti at the wall, and hopefully some of it is
I
good
take it.
sticks. Good. So first of all, great question and great project. And I think you're doing the hard work, because I think finding new ways to extract the data we look for, the data we need, that's the job, right? That is really the job of a scientist, is to find out what it is we want to study and how we can study it. I have gone from being extremely skeptical of rating scales to liking rating scales to then hating them again. I'm now in the hating them stage. I'm sure I'll go back to liking them again. And so I'm also currently working on microphenomenology as a potential approach, because this is probably too much information, but the reason I'm drawn to it is because I have also started to hate the idea that our interactions with others can be scaled linearly. What I mean by that is I think that the real feelings we have when we interact with others can't be expressed in a linear time domain, that we have these moments of clarity, of connectedness that are so much bigger relative to the amount of time that they took. And what I've understood from my very, very, very naive take on microphenomenology is that it gives you this opportunity to hone in on these special moments. And I think that especially when dealing with the cohorts that you're dealing with, that is going to be critical, because I think that they're, not being an autistic individual myself, but for the little bit of work that I've done on it, what I've found fascinating is this idea that not only can we not superimpose our understanding of how time passes for us when we interact with others, I think that their experience of interacting with others, the time scale of it is very different as well. The hard bits, and we know this from our own experience of hard, challenging scenarios, right? Things that are hard feel bigger and larger and longer. And I think what might be really good, and maybe this is why you're also drawn to microphenomenology, is you'll be able to hone in on these changing timescales. The other approaches obviously range from more traditional things like rating scales. I've used the SAM, I always say the SAM mannequins, but it's the SAM rating scales of arousal, valence, dominance. We have also done descriptives. We've done emoji grids, because we've also dealt with a range of ages. So we've worked with children and adolescents, and there the emoji grids were very useful as well when we were trying to understand how it made them feel. For co-presence, we're currently devising various methods that we think are most useful, again, across a gamut. So we're also studying seniors, and they're trying to explain what we mean by a feeling of co-presence in virtual reality becomes, quite loaded. So we're busy devising some methods on looking at co-presence, and I'll be happy to talk about that a little bit more. And lastly, I do really, really now strongly believe that we should spend longer doing debriefs after our experiments. I think at the end of the day, all the measures that we take in the experiment are obviously helpful when you're trying to do an event-related, analysis of your brain data, and you want to know how to weight that specific trial. And so I understand it, but I more and more get frustrated by what that actually does to the experience. And secondly, sometimes it takes a while for it to sink in, for us to become metacognitively aware of how we feel about something that's just happened. And so more and more, especially with our virtual reality paradigms, we're having long debrief sessions where we give the participants the opportunity to relive some of the experiences, so they can watch some of the videos. They can tell us in their own words how they felt. And it's becoming more like an interview process in which we record it analyze the data, and so on. And I feel like that's probably where a lot of my work is now going to have to go, especially when dealing with these really different age groups, number one, but also because we're dealing in these contexts, these virtual environments where a lot of the feelings are a little bit weird, like at first. So I don't know if that helps you. I basically, I'm suggesting you have to try it all and figure out which fits best. As always, and as I always tell my own students, you have to find the tool that is going to answer the question that you're interested in. And if you're interested in, as I said, figuring out how to weight your event-related design, then you need a trial-by-trial rating. And good luck finding one that you think is good.
Thank you.
You know, how you anchor it and how you Z-score it and so on and so on. But I'm hoping that we are going to become better at making experiments that aren't repetitive, that aren't filled with a million rating scales, because the more and more that I do them, as I said, I mean, I hate rating scales mood, but the more and more I do it, I feel like it just is extremely artificial, extremely bad for keeping the flow in a repeated measures design. And I also worry that we always then have to somehow reinterpret. We've chosen the rating scale because it is close to the question we want to ask. But then we have to make inferences about how it fits our specific design. So you talked about the self in other. I just showed you this data with these virtual avatars that are confetti, like that have no boundary. When you ask about self in other, where you've literally been able to go into the other person's skin, are you asking about whether you literally felt like you overlapped? Or are you asking whether or not you felt like they came into your body? Or are you asking whether you felt like you were one body? I mean, you have to make a lot of inferences post hoc, which can be quite dangerous. So I suppose what I'm saying is there is no right answer. Good. But I'm happy to chat more if you have like more specific questions, like on co-presence, on enlargement. For enlargement, I forgot to say, we're actually now designing a tool where they can, so we started with a SAM mannequin where they could show body size or perceived dominance, which is the amount of control that they have. And now I'm actually messing around with creating an avatar that they can shrink in relative size and talk about this, like literally show me whether or not they felt an enlargement or not.
Thank you. You fed me a lot, and I will probably.
Good luck with your PhD. I'm sure we will meet again. I have a good feeling.
I will probably contact you. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Anne.
So, questions at home or here? I have a question for you regarding the last study. So I was wondering whether you were doing like some correlations with people that like to be touched or to touch, and like, or empathy or things like that associated to the personality of
Wonderful question. We are actually, I would probably say that about 50% of the studies that are ongoing in my lab at the moment are entirely dedicated to these so-called touch preferences, because maybe you've already realized this about me, but I'm a cynic. I'm an optimist and very positive being, but I'm extremely cynical. And one of my biggest misgivings about working in the field of social touch is that there is I think, a disproportionate amount of research on the so-called positive effects of touch, and that it's always good and, reduces arousal and so on. And even though that's what I've shown you today, well, a lot of the work that we're doing in my lab is to look at individual differences, mainly because the hope is in these virtual environments, we potentially have the possibility of catering to individual differences. So one of the benefits I see of the environment that you are asking about is that for those people who actually don't like real physical touch, this might be a way for them to still feel connected to others, but without any of the negative connotations of what can be extremely intimate and therefore frightening skin-to-skin contact. So in the data that I showed you, I didn't go into these social touch preferences, but we capture that with a barrage of questionnaires. Again, and we've tried questionnaires as well. And what we're currently doing now is actually mapping out a landscape of so-called touch preferences, or what I actually prefer to talk about, which is the dimensions or the parameters that determine whether or not we approach or avoid instances of social touch. What we're currently analyzing related to your question is exactly that, whether or not people who are so-called touchy-feely, who are less touch-averse, who want more touch, i.e. me, whether or not they actually enjoy this connection with pseudohaptics more than without. My hope is actually that this, as I said, that this kind of environment is actually better suited to those people who otherwise don't like social touch. So I think what you'd probably see is that people who do like social touch will enjoy both conditions. They like to be close to people. We also measure this sort of approach avoidance preference or balance as a function of that interpersonal distance that I spoke about today. And that could potentially be one way in which I've already showed you some data as to social touch preferences. People who have a smaller interpersonal distance are those who prefer to be close to others and are okay with being close to others and potentially being touched by others. But yes, we've also just recently done a study which is under review, in which we look at empathy-like traits. I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more. But yeah, most of the projects in my group at the moment are trying to go in that direction, with the hope that when we look at not just these pseudo-haptic illusions of touch, but also some of the digital haptic devices that we are developing. We have a thermal vest, we have a vibrotactile sleeve, whether or not these haptic technologies are another alternative for people who shy away from actual skin-to-skin contact.
This is super cool, and I feel like it will be also useful for some clinical populations also.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the most exciting project that I have on the board right now is working with women who are 6 months before giving birth, and we track them for 6 months afterwards, because their bodies are changing. And from personal experience, and I don't mind sharing this with you because I can't see any of you, so I feel absolutely no shame. But when you go through a pregnancy, it has some fairly traumatic effects on how you feel about your body and whether or not you want to be touched, and even by the people you love the most, including your baby. And we are tracking these changes in touch preferences and touch behaviors over this very tricky phase in a woman's life, with the hope of trying to then, with a better understanding of these feelings of disgust that they have, this sort of rejection of the touch that their loved ones are trying to give them, ways of getting back into their bodies and also back into the cycle of touch. This is work that's also been done in women with postnatal depression, where you again want to try and break the cycle where they have or restart the cycle rather of touch, where they've stopped touching their baby because they don't like touching the baby, they don't get the positive effects of touching the baby, and you try and get them back into touch. And I think again that might be something that could be done within these virtual domains, in which the threat and the connotations of touch are maybe reduced.
A lot of potential. Thank you so much for your answers. Do we have other questions here in the room or at home? If not, okay, I have one last question. Sorry. It's about the self-hidden and self-seen study. Maybe I didn't grasp really what the difference was in terms of results, because I think the range wasn't the same in both graphs.
Yeah, so those are the worst possible representations. What we found in our results is that the self-hidden shows actually, compared to the self shown, lower levels of coordination, but that as a result of this sort of shift in focus, we see greater like higher scores on some of the subjective measures, including cohesion, trust, and there's one other, and I can't remember it now. So the trade-off of the shift in focus from having to integrate self and other information means that I now have to focus all my effort and attention on the other, which somehow bonds you together. And I think what that data tried to was helpful for me is to realize this sort of non-orthogonal relationship between the coordination performance, which we always try to optimize. We like use it as a metric of that they did the task well, therefore it made them feel more connected. But in this case, actually data I didn't show you at the group level as well, in our experts, they made a trade-off in coordination performance. They were less coordinated in the leader-led conditions because they started to explore richer or more complex movements. So they traded off creativity for coordination, and at a subjective level, they rated this higher in terms of mood, cohesion. There was one other. I keep forgetting the third. But basically what that whole data set kept showing me is that coordination isn't everything, or at least not optimal coordination isn't everything. Sometimes it's actually okay to be misaligned temporally. That just simply having to focus in on another person may make you feel connected at another level. Or in a group of experts, you may trade off being perfectly synchronized because you actually want to try something new in the movement plane.
Thank you so much. So do we have any more questions? I know it's late, right, where you are right now?
Like I said, I have 5 kids, so I don't think I sleep very much. So late is a relative term.
Well, we hope to see you in Montreal and see more of your studies. It's super exciting, and
Thank you so much. Yeah, I know Guillaume keeps inviting me, and as I said, my littlest is 3 years old, so I think I am almost ready to travel.
so maybe we'll see you at CerebrUM. And thank you so much for your talk.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation. And again, I'm so sorry for being a few minutes late. I really am grateful to have been able to still talk to you today. Thank you so much, everybody. And please reach out whenever you need. Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely rest of your day. Bye.